Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is League for Republic Democracy of Australia. This is Harry J. Stiller, current Chief President, League for Republic Democracy of Australia, LFDRA. This is another page 3 in League for Republic Democracy of Australia. Australia and the states within Australia, human rights abuse atrocities, slavery entrapments. One moment, please, just technical glitch. Human rights abuse atrocities, slavery entrapments, and murderous chemical warfare rampages atrocities are some of the worst human rights atrocities seen on planet Earth, as we know it today, by Liberal, Labor and staffers' favouritism ideologies in their human rights abusive law circles, who in their right mind would vote in state and federal parliaments the way Liberal, Labor, National parties and the Greens vote. In state parliaments and federal parliaments have never voted to do what's right for the people of Australia. All they do is take the money from a select few and vote in favouritism circles amongst the select few, with media backers then destroyed other media broadcast licences and other narrowcast licences. Australia and the states within Australia should be ashamed of its human rights abuses, vicious abduct and drug and torture and murderous regimes, and slavery, entrapment, homelessness. The people of Wentworth just elected a chemical warfare rampagist, chemical warfare abduct and drug and torture rampage, chemical warfare ideologue of vicious abduct and drug and torture regimes, ideologue in protection of Liberal, Labor and favouritism staffers of abduct and drug and torture and murder regimes. We will end the abduct and drug mentality of Bill Scott, Tanya, Labor, Liberal and the Greens of abduct and drug with mind-controlled chemical warfare in Australia, as Scott Morrison announces $1 billion plus for an expansion in abducting, drugging Australians with mind-controlled chemical warfare of a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage. Liberal, Labor and their staffers. We do not support League for Republic Democracy of Australia. We do not support Liberal, Labor, National parties or the Greens, and are not associated with the above human rights abuses and trust misuse and abuse and slavery, entrapment, murderous chemical warfare rampage by Scott, Bill and their staffers. Long live a League for Republic Democracy of Australia government and LFDRA government, League for Republic Democracy of Australia government in Australia, ending Liberal, Labor and National parties and staffers' chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia. Yet again, Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus expansion for a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia, Fed-funded expansion by staffers, advisors and Liberal, Labor and National parties, Fed-funded chemical warfare rampage and state-facilitated extortion. And like I said earlier, and yet again, Scott Morrison's Liberal Party staffers and advisors green-lighted $1 billion plus expansion of a chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia. We saw a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage by Hitler in Germany. We see German scientists, Korean scientists, and other Asian country scientists creating chemical warfare in labs around Australia. We saw al-Assad in Syria use chemical warfare on the populace of that country, and yet again, those that represent a crown in this country and are staffers of Liberal, Labor and National parties in Australia, a stealthy Scott Morrison commits $1 billion plus to a murderous, torturous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia of an abduct and drug and torture with mind-controlled chemical warfare and many murders and destruction of life expectancy in Australia of abduct and drug and torture of vicious, violent abduct and drug and torture regimes within Scott Morrison's Labor, Liberal and National Party abduct and drug and torture with chemical weaponry warfare, as we saw Hitler, al-Assad and those that represent a crown in this country of Australia do. And we saw the overthrow of Ukraine by chemical warfare, and we also saw a vicious abduct and drug and torture with chemical warfare under Stalin's Soviet Union era in Pasikna, Russia, of an abduct and drug and torture mentality, as we see in Australia by those that represent a crown, like I said earlier, with vicious mind control, abduct and drug torture regimes. We are League for Republic Democracy of Australia at website lfdra.org, spoken and written by current Chief President, League for Republic Democracy of Australia, Harry J. Stiller, at our logo political organisation website, lfdra.org. There's also the page lfdra.org Clive Collins Scab Picker Pics, his scabs. So that, and wipes it on the wall at both chemical warfare gulags, chemical weaponry warfare gulag lockups. There are multiples of Clive Collins scab picks and wool blood wipe stains on the walls at both Clarence Valley chemical warfare gulag lockups. In no way, shape or form is mind control chemical warfare gulag extortion a health product. And like I said earlier, yet again, Scott Morrison commits $1 billion more to chemical weaponry warfare on the populace of Australia. We will end, under a League for Republic Democracy of Australia government, we will end mind control chemical warfare on the populace of Australia. That Scott Morrison issued writs for $1 billion spend on mind control chemical warfare on the populace of Australia with a murderous chemical warfare gulag rampage. Just to add, someone broke in earlier, a couple of weeks ago, and smashed my chair up, so I can't use my chair anymore. So for all Australian citizens under a League for Republic Democracy of Australia government in Australia, plus 17 million complementary 3-bedroom homes for Australians with ownership title documents and the 8 kilowatt solar power household generation allowance, and righting the wrongs of 1970 to 1975. We will also phase out state sectional driver's licences with Australia-wide driver's licensing centres. Victimisation has occurred for too many productive Australians commuting safely to and from work within Australia, and including international law licences that drive on the same side of the road as Australians and other Australia-wide road users, with a new Australia-wide driver's licensing centres, Australia-wide governed by a MyGov service delivery platform with the new Australia-wide licensing centres, ending the vicious victimisation of productive Australians commuting safely to and from work, as well as phasing out oil, refined and ethanol fuels driven motor vehicles by 2020. For too long, Australia legislated insurance extortion has occurred for too many productive Australians, and victimisations on Australians, also ending mind control, weaponised, forced abduction, extortion, chemical weaponry gulags in Australia. After prolonged forced abduction, chemical warfare gulag torture, which the Torture Act was 1972, which outlawed torture, comes stroke and destruction of cardiovascular health and syndromes such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome causing death. Many, many people in Australia have been murdered by auxiliaries. One time in Queensland, I don't want to get into it, but if you said the shit word, if you said shit, they would push you to the floor, drug you, and put you into seclusion for saying shit, and drug you further with chemical weaponry. Gulags in Australia, and police auxiliaries were abducting and raping their chemical warfare tortured victims, and then they would use chemical warfare against the witnesses of police brutality with chemical warfare, and other chemical weapon gulags funds extortion. And Scott Morrison announced $1 billion plus for a murderous extortion, forced abduction, chemical weaponry warfare gulags in Australia, that staffers of auxiliaries and party staffers advisors were state employees raping their victims for pregnancy category testings, for other extortion mechanisms, and then people that witnessed that or were witness to a victim's story, they would use chemical warfare against them, which is the vicious law circles that we see in Australia, of chemical weaponry gulags in Australia. The Australian Parliament and staffers of the Liberal Party created slavery entrapment. It's hot in here as the air conditioner doesn't work because they've never fixed it. Entrapment in aged care in Australia through a federal government-based training package for below poverty line slavery entrapped Australians. This is what the Liberal Party government did with their staffers, the staffers advisors, Australians, to basically work as poverty entrapped slaves in aged care for nothing, and then end up with flat rate slavery entrapment rate of pay under the current Australian Parliament. That destroyed care quality in Australia by the Australian Parliament for cost cutting, slavery entrapment, and a reduction in quality for shareholders and investors in poverty aged care sector in Australia. And to add, my great grandfather had his legs cut off And because there's state law says you can't say a thing about people like Patel that was working in health. Patel was working in health. He did all those unnecessary surgeries, and state law says you can't say a thing. You can't say a thing in this country, such as I referred to on the pregnancy category testing earlier on in this, that you can't refer to other government's intelligence services working in health within Australia about, as we saw, the pregnancy category testings and the raping of victims and witnesses of the raping of victims in chemical warfare gulags. So anyway, he was being tortured every day by aged care and the government. He was a military trainer and the government could not even give him his legs. Also ending slavery entrapment with a wage minimum in Australia set at $79,000 per year with a 4 weeks paid holiday and 12 personal days a year. And federal legislator, that's a first sitting day, is the Australian minimum wage of $79,000 plus the 15% super and the other entitlements on top of that. The Fair Work Commission follow-up compliance, $50,000 fines per minute any employee in Australia is underpaid the Australian minimum, and creation of the ABNS numbers for self-managed superannuations and investments or accruals, including traineeships and apprenticeships in Australia, and superannuation rates as a federal minimum of 15% on top of the $79,000 per year with an 8.5% tax rate and the 11.5% tax rate for over the 1,000 millions, which is $1 billion. We see Australia wads of cash commercial media that gets paid by pharmacy claim 1 in 4 Australians will need to be demoralised, abused, strangled, tortured by state services that claim federal funds for big new houses, luxury cars, and to keep their job and increase neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Mental inducement takes place by the states within Australia that have failed the people. As torture, as I said earlier, as torture was outlawed in Australia in 1972 within Australia, they forced people into signing Medicare release forms for federal funds to fund the new flash houses, big new luxury cars. Mind Freedom Australia movement that's also another Facebook page. There's a page on lfdra.org, which is League for a Public Democracy of Australia, political logo website. So Mind Freedom Australia movement is here to protect the interests of Australian lives. The states weren't abducting Australians, so I'll go over this again. As the media claim, 1 in 4 Australians will suffer mental inducement at the hand of the state and ultimately cause a syndrome called neuroleptic malignant syndrome, causes death. Non-mental induced Australians, for example, non-chemical induced Australians that are abducted, then tortured in seclusion, pushed to the floor, strangled, then drugged and detained for federal extortion by their abductors, share the M cover for the protection of our lives. We saw that what happened with the McDonald family abattoir and the McDonald family abattoir opposing it, and what happened there. End torture in Australia, as it was outlawed in 1972, as well as mental state inducement. Chemical warfare in Australia, the Queen wants institutional slavery entrapment and a murderous chemical warfare campaign on the populace of Australia, doing the wrong thing by the people of Australia and destroying life expectancy. A murderous campaign by the Liberal, Labor and National Chemical Mind Control weaponised gulags in Australia, and many murders and destruction of life expectancy in Australia by their chemical warfare on the populace. We know chemical warfare gulags in Australia, facilitators in mind control chemical warfare gulags in Australia were green-lighted by banks. This is true, were green-lighted by banks for house investment exploits that made 80% of the population of Australia homeless renters. And if it wasn't bad enough that life expectancy decreased in the population of Australia by mind control chemical warfare gulags, that even the American federal government outlawed the chemical mind control weapons used by chemical weapon gulags in Australia. Long live Republic of Australia. QLD Labor Party mind control weapon gulags and staffers and advisors that were non-integral members of the Australian community fortified non-integral mind control chemical weapon gulags in Queensland in their current term of office in Queensland, breaching freedoms Australians deserve. And in Tasmania, Hobart, we saw the Liberal Party increase mind control chemical and other mind control weaponised gulags in Tasmania, breaching the freedoms Australians deserve. Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, John Howard, Malcolm Turnbull all support a murderous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia through their chemical warfare gulags. Even Scott Morrison has committed the extra $1 billion plus in a chemical warfare gulag, facilitated by a murderous rampage by state governments, palletised plastic extortions, a former Mark Butler's past ministry on the populace of Australia, in which the Fed facilitates The murderous chemical warfare campaign, as the Torture Act was outlawed in the Torture Act is not the Anti-Torture Act is 1972. Chemical warfare campaign facilitated by state extortionists for plastic storage and power plays that ASIO allowed a murderous campaign on the populace of Australia. We know state law is not compliant with federal law. We know that the Liberal Party, Labor Party and National Party staffers and members invested in bankhouse investment exploits that ended home ownership title documents for 80% of the population, and the Fair Work Commission resignation on doing what's right for the people of Australia. We saw the Liberal Party. Which way do Liberal Party, National Party vote? They vote to cut hospitality wages in Australia. And this is what they do: forcefully abducted and drugged by state terrorists. I call them their chemical warfare. We saw the pregnancy category testings and witnesses against the pregnancy category testings that would speak up against it, and what they would do, such as push them to the floor, strangle them and drug them, so they wouldn't have any inkling of incrimination against them. This is how they use chemical warfare in state law favouritism circles, and it's a disgrace in this country. So many induced strokes by these state extortion force mind controls. And the Ink and Plastic Printer pays the state scum of Australia. And the Hostage Act, 1989, and there's the one on 1972 too, 1972 and 1989, the Hostage Act, abducting and drugging for extortion, and that's 1989, the Hostage Act, so the abducting and drugging for extortion, and then torture with the chemical warfare, that's 1972, which was the outlawing of torture and such as hostage, abducting and drugging for extortion. This is what happens, and Scott Morrison's spending $1 billion to do that to Australians, as well as have a stroke from the American FBI that wrote the manual and the Fed paying the ransoms as foreign powers fortify their infiltrated powers, as the infiltrations in state law in Australia actually claimed you could not say a thing about people like Dr. Patel that did unnecessary surgeries in Australia. Deaths by polypharmacy. Polypharmacy is a term of overprescription in unnecessary chemical warfare. And this is true. 18 Liberal Party guns turned up at my mum's house. People are being murdered, strangled, tortured by state services. Liberal state employees are raping their victims under chemical warfare inducement for palletised plastic extortions and palletised plastic storage. Long live Republic of Australia. And like I said, again, I'll say it again, in total, 18 Liberal Party guns turned up at my mum's house. People are being murdered, strangled, tortured by state services. Liberal state employees, like I said, they're doing that thing. Long live Republic of Australia. And people are being murdered by state Liberal Party staffers for being productive commuters to and from work. Liberal Party staffers were doing all that. Witnesses that were witnesses to victims' statements were being drugged and tortured by these chemical weaponry gulags because they were doing the pregnancy category testings for palletised extortions. We know chemical warfare gulags in Australia, facilitators in mind control chemical warfare gulags in Australia were green-lighted by banks for house investment exploits that made 80% of the population of Australia homeless renters. And if it wasn't bad enough that life expectancy decreased in the population of Australia by mind-controlled chemical warfare gulags, that even, like I said, this is true, that even the American federal government outlawed the chemical mind-control weapons used by chemical weapon gulags in Australia. Long live Republic of Australia. LFDRA.org, our political logo website, LFDRA.org, ending mind-control, weaponised, forced abduction, chemical weaponry gulags in Australia. So I've already said this before, after prolonged forced abduction, chemical warfare gulag torture comes stroke and destruction of cardiovascular health and syndromes such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome causes death. Many people in Australia have been murdered by auxiliaries and forced abduction chemical weaponry gulags in Australia, and the thing with state employees and their chemical warfare torture, abduction, extortion, and hostage of abduction and extortion through the 1989 Hostage Act, abducting and drugging Australians and their pregnancy category testings, and those that spoke against the pregnancy category testings of further chemical warfare torture against them. So ABNS numbers for superannuation. This is Chief and President, LFDRA, League for Republic Democracy of Australia, Harry J. Stiller, lfdra.org/Australia. That's another page. There'll be plus 17 million complementary 3-bedroom homes for Australians with ownership title documents and the 8 kilowatt solar power household generation allowance for all Australian citizens under a League for Republic Democracy of Australia government in Australia. Also ending slavery entrapment with a wage minimum in Australia set at the $79,000 per year. And I've already gone over that earlier today in the $50,000 fines. So again, in other economic terms, that'll be $333,000 per complementary 3-bedroom homes with ownership title documents and a tax rate of 8.5% and the 11.5% tax rate for over the 1,000 millions to the billion, including that's 3,300 $100 notes print per complementary 3-bedroom homes. Don't listen to this. The government's in debt to the people of Australia. The government is definitely in debt to the people of Australia through taxation, slavery, extortions and whatnot. The government of Australia is in debt to the people of Australia, and whatnot. So kilowatt household generation allowance and raising the federal minimum Australia-wide for all Australian citizens under a League for Republic Democracy of Australia government in Australia, and all of that. So we'll open the Australia-wide driver's licensing centres. Australia-wide driver's licensing centres with the MyGov service delivery platform. lfdra.org, Registration Australia. Oh yeah, here we go. So we know chemical warfare gulags in Australia were green lighted by banks for house investment exploits that made 80% of the population of Australia homeless renters. And if it wasn't bad enough, that life expectancy decreased in the population of Australia by mind control chemical warfare gulags, that even, like I said, the American federal government, I've been over that. Breaching freedoms Australians deserve. And in Tasmania, Hobart, we saw the Liberal Party increase mind control chemical and other mind control weaponised gulags in Tasmania. Breaching the freedoms Australians deserve. Scott Morrison, Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, John Howard, Malcolm Turnbull all supported a murderous chemical warfare rampage on the populace of Australia through their chemical warfare gulags, facilitated by a murderous rampage by state governments, palletised plastic extortions under a Mark Butler's past ministry on the populace of Australia, in which the Fed facilitates. We saw the Hostage Act 1989, direct violation of that one, and the Anti-Torture Act, which was 1972. Murderous chemical warfare campaign facilitated by state extortionists. We've been over that. Find out more about lfdra.org, League for Republic Democracy of Australia. Scroll through all of our pages and stay up to date with us on social media platform Facebook, and bookmark lfdra.org, ending mind control weaponised force abduction chemical weaponry gulags in Australia and all.